a lonely shoreline in southern Italy. Nightfall, sometime during the 8th century BC. A Greek vessel grinds against the shallow seabed as waves push it toward the coast. The ship is packed with everything its passengers own: ceramic jars, tools, supplies, and entire families searching for a new beginning. Men leap into waist-deep water, straining to pull the heavy hull forward before the surf tears it apart. In the darkness, distant sounds drift across the beach, perhaps barking dogs, perhaps the voices of strangers, or perhaps nothing more than the wind. No one waiting on this shore is certain to welcome them, yet turning back would likely mean starvation or death at sea. So what convinced these settlers to risk everything in order to establish new homes on the coast of Italy? And how did their flourishing world eventually become part of an expanding Roman Republic? Centuries before Rome emerged as the unrivaled master of the Mediterranean, the southern regions of the Italian peninsula were already being transformed by Greek-speaking settlers. Beginning in the 8th century BC, groups from the Greek world crossed the Ionian Sea and founded a chain of colonies along Italy's southern coastline. Over time, this region became known as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Cities such as Taras, Sybaris, and Neapolis developed into thriving centers of commerce, craftsmanship, philosophy, and culture. Their prosperity reached far beyond their walls, influencing neighboring peoples, and eventually leaving a profound mark on Roman education, religion, literature, and art. This is the story of the Greeks in Italy, how they reshaped the south, built prosperous city-states, and ultimately saw their political independence disappear beneath Roman expansion, even as much of their culture survived within the civilization that conquered them. Nearly 2,800 years ago, the Italian peninsula looked nothing like it would in later centuries. Instead of a unified power, the landscape was divided among numerous communities, tribes, and emerging societies, each maintaining its own traditions, alliances, and trading networks. The familiar pattern of densely settled Greek-style city-states had not yet appeared. Then, ships from across the sea began arriving, carrying not only settlers but also unfamiliar customs, beliefs, technologies, and ways of life. Archaeological evidence indicates that Greek settlement in Italy was not the result of one organized migration, but of many separate expeditions launched over several generations. Among the earliest settlers were people from the Euboean cities of Chalcis and Eretria. Around the middle of the 8th century BC, they founded Pythagoras on what is now the island of Ischia, just off the Bay of Naples. Soon afterward, they established Cumae on the mainland, creating what became one of the earliest and most influential Greek colonies in Italy. Cumae played an especially significant role in spreading Greek culture across the peninsula. Through contacts with neighboring peoples, it helped transmit a version of the Euboean alphabet that would later influence Etruscan writing and eventually contribute to the development of the Latin alphabet itself. As the first settlements prospered, additional groups from across the Greek world followed. Achaean colonists founded important cities, including Sybaris and Croton, along the Gulf of Taranto, while Spartan settlers established Taras, the only major Spartan colony in Italy. According to later tradition, Taras owed its origin to Phalanthus, who was instructed by an oracle to seek the place where rain falls from a cloudless sky. Later storytellers interpreted this mysterious prophecy as the tears shed by his wife, Aethra, which eventually guided him to the coast near modern Saturo, only a short distance from present-day Taranto. Ancient legends also tell of another Greek figure whose story became linked with Italy's earliest past. Evander, a hero remembered in later Greek and Roman tradition, was said to have journeyed from Arcadia to central Italy long before the legendary founding of Rome. Writing in the 1st century BC, Dionysius of Halicarnassus claimed that Evander established a settlement called Pallantium beside the Tiber River, on the site that later became Rome's Palatine Hill. Although these stories remain part of mythology rather than established history, archaeology has shown that the area of Rome was occupied centuries before the traditional founding date of 753 BC. Excavations on the Palatine Hill have uncovered remains of huts dating back to the 10th and 9th centuries BC. Imported pottery and other artifacts discovered in later layers also demonstrate that these early communities were connected to wider Mediterranean trade long before Rome emerged as a major power. Why so many Greeks chose to leave their homeland remains a subject of debate. Earlier, historians often argued that growing populations, shortages of farmland, limited natural resources, and periods of hardship forced many communities to seek opportunities overseas. More recent interpretations suggest that ambition played an equally important role, with merchants, settlers, and aristocrats looking to expand commercial networks and gain wealth in new territories. Most likely, there was no single explanation. Population pressure, political rivalries, economic opportunity, and the promise of greater status abroad all encouraged migration. Whatever their individual motives may have been, the consequences were undeniable. By the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the Greek colonies of southern Italy and Sicily had evolved into some of the wealthiest and most influential cities in the western Mediterranean. They were no longer isolated trading stations, but independent powers whose prosperity, political influence, and cultural achievements reshaped the region for centuries to come. As the Greek colonies matured, their influence spread well beyond their city walls. Trade connected them with neighboring peoples, while their language, religion, and customs gradually reached communities throughout southern Italy. Rather than remaining isolated settlements, these colonies became dynamic centers where ideas, commerce, and cultural traditions constantly mixed with local societies. The peoples living across southern Italy did not simply disappear in the face of Greek expansion. Communities such as the Oenotrians, and later the Lucanians and Bruttians, continued to occupy much of the interior. In Sicily, the Sicels and other native groups maintained their own identities as well. Contact between Greeks and indigenous populations was continuous. Sometimes relations were peaceful and based on trade. At other times, competition over land and resources led to conflict. Yet across many regions, cultural exchange proved just as important as warfare. Over generations, many local communities adopted aspects of Greek civilization in a process historians describe as Hellenization. Greek-inspired alphabets were adapted to write local languages. Temples dedicated to Greek deities appeared alongside traditional places of worship, and artistic styles from across the Aegean found new expression in Italy. Architecture, sculpture, pottery, and even daily customs reflected an increasing blend of Greek and native traditions. Still, this transformation was never identical everywhere. Some regions embraced Greek influence extensively, while others preserved much of their older cultural identity, creating societies that combined elements of both worlds. Ancient writers later looked back on this remarkable transformation with admiration. The geographer Strabo observed that Greek influence became so widespread across southern Italy and Sicily that the entire region earned the name Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. By the 5th century BC, its leading cities ranked among the richest communities in the western Mediterranean. Fertile plains produced abundant harvests, while strategically located harbors connected merchants with markets stretching from mainland Greece to North Africa and beyond. Among the greatest powers of the Greek West stood Syracuse on Sicily. Blessed with an outstanding natural harbor and commanding an important position along Mediterranean trade routes, the city expanded into one of the largest and most influential Greek settlements outside the Aegean. Its military strength, economic prosperity, and cultural achievements placed it alongside the most prestigious city-states of the Greek world. Centuries later, the Roman statesman Cicero would describe Syracuse as both the greatest and among the most beautiful of all Greek cities. Yet Syracuse was far from the only center of wealth. On the Italian mainland, Sybaris developed a reputation that spread throughout the ancient world. Ancient authors portrayed it as a city of extraordinary prosperity whose influence extended over a vast territory. Although some surviving accounts claim enormous population figures and massive armies, modern historians generally regard these numbers as exaggerated. Even so, there is little doubt that Sybaris exercised considerable power through its extensive network of dependent communities and its openness toward newcomers, which helped strengthen both its economy and political influence. The city's prosperity eventually became legendary. Luxury was so closely associated with Sybaris that its very name later became synonymous with extravagant living. Wealthy citizens enjoyed spacious homes, elegant clothing, elaborate banquets, music and entertainment on a scale that impressed and sometimes shocked other Greeks. Ancient writer Athenaeus even claimed that ingenious underground systems carried wine directly from vineyards outside the city to storage facilities near the harbor. Whether this remarkable story reflected reality or served as a moral lesson against excess remains uncertain, as archaeology has uncovered no evidence for such a network. Nevertheless, both ancient testimony and modern research agree that Sybaris stood among the richest cities of Magna Graecia. Only a short distance to the south, another colony was rising into prominence. Croton combined fertile farmland with military discipline and intellectual prestige to become one of the dominant powers of southern Italy. Rich agricultural production generated substantial food surpluses, supporting a growing population while creating considerable wealth. Its silver coinage circulated widely across the Mediterranean, strengthening Croton's reputation as an important commercial center as well as a political and military force. Around 530 BC, Croton entered a new chapter in its history when the philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras arrived from the Eastern Greek world. There, he established the community that would later become one of antiquity's most influential philosophical schools. His followers, known as the Pythagoreans, gradually became deeply involved in the city's political and intellectual life. Ancient traditions suggest they exercised considerable influence over Croton's ruling elite, although modern historians continue to debate exactly how much authority they truly held and whether later accounts exaggerated their role. Under this intellectual movement, Croton gained a reputation that extended far beyond military success. The city became associated with mathematics, philosophy, science, music, and disciplined living. Scholars and students traveled from across the Greek world to learn from Pythagoras and his circle. Their teachings emphasized harmony, moderation, physical fitness, and self-control, principles that shaped not only personal conduct, but also the city's broader political culture. Croton's military strength grew alongside its intellectual prestige. Its citizens were renowned for rigorous physical training and strict discipline, qualities that produced one of the most respected armies in Magna Graecia. This reputation would soon be tested by a conflict with its prosperous northern neighbor, Sybaris. For years, tensions had simmered between the two cities over territorial claims and political disagreements. The immediate crisis erupted when hundreds of exiles from Sybaris sought refuge within Croton's borders. Refusing to surrender them transformed an already fragile relationship into open hostility. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the history of the Greek colonies in the West. Prosperous cities rarely collapsed because they lacked wealth or resources. More often, political disputes escalated into fear. Fear hardened into confrontation, and confrontation ultimately led to war. In 510 BC, Croton marched against Sybaris under the command of Milo, the celebrated Olympic champion whose physical achievements had already become legendary throughout Greece. The campaign ended in a decisive victory for Croton. Sybaris, once celebrated as one of the richest cities in the Mediterranean, was devastated. Its power vanished with astonishing speed, bringing an abrupt end to centuries of extraordinary prosperity. Many historians regard the destruction of Sybaris as an important turning point in the history of Magna Graecia. Although Greek civilization continued to flourish in many regions, the balance of power had begun to shift. During the following centuries, numerous colonies gradually lost both their dominance and eventually their political independence. Throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BC, many Greek cities on the Italian mainland faced increasing pressure from Italic peoples, particularly the Lucanians and the Bruttians. Communities such as Thurii, Hipponion, Tyrrhena, and Poseidonia endured repeated attacks. Some successfully resisted for a time, while others eventually fell under foreign control. Hipponion was conquered by the Bruttians, and Poseidonia passed into Lucanian hands, where it became known as Paestum. Meanwhile, events in Sicily unfolded according to their own relentless rhythm. For generations, the island remained divided between two powerful civilizations. Carthaginian settlements, including Motia and Panormus, dominated much of the western coastline, while Greek cities such as Syracuse and Acragas controlled the east. Competition over fertile farmland, strategic ports, and valuable maritime trade routes ensured that peace was usually temporary. The struggle between these rival powers developed into the long series of conflicts now known as the Greco-Punic or Sicilian Wars, battles that would shape the island's future for centuries. During the long struggle for Sicily, Carthage inflicted devastating losses on several Greek settlements. In 409 BC, its armies swept across the island, destroying a number of important cities, including Selinus. That same campaign also saw the capture and destruction of Himera under the command of the Carthaginian general Hannibal Mago, an earlier commander who should not be confused with the more famous Hannibal Barca of the later Punic Wars. Only a few years afterward, in 406 BC, another major Greek center fell. Acragas, celebrated for its wealth, monumental temples, and thriving population, was overwhelmed after a prolonged siege. The city's defeat marked one of the darkest moments in Sicilian Greek history and demonstrated just how formidable Carthage had become. Yet Carthaginian success was never absolute. Despite repeated invasions and spectacular victories, complete domination of Sicily remained beyond its reach. The Greek cities continued to resist, and nowhere was that resistance more determined than at Syracuse. One of the most dramatic reversals came in 397 BC. Carthage launched a massive campaign against Syracuse, hoping to eliminate its greatest rival once and for all. At first, the siege appeared promising, but disaster soon struck the invading army. Disease spread rapidly through the crowded camps, crippling thousands of soldiers and weakening Carthage's ability to continue the offensive. Recognizing the opportunity, Dionysius I, the ruler of Syracuse, acted decisively. Rather than waiting behind the city's walls, he organized coordinated attacks by both land and sea. Greek forces struck the Punic fleet, while additional troops assaulted the Carthaginian positions surrounding the city. The combination of military pressure and epidemic disease shattered the siege. Although the campaign did not end Carthaginian influence in Sicily, it forced the invaders into a costly withdrawal. Syracuse survived, and the balance of power on the island remained contested rather than settled. Over the following century, warfare continued as neither side proved capable of securing permanent control over the entire island. Eventually, a series of treaties established an uneasy balance. By the beginning of the 4th century BC, repeated agreements recognized a practical division of Sicily between the competing powers. A major settlement concluded in 306 BC largely confirmed this arrangement, leaving Carthage dominant in the western part of the island, while Syracuse retained control over the east. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Greek cities might enjoy a period of stability. But while they remained focused on their long rivalry with Carthage, another power was quietly transforming the political landscape of the Italian peninsula. To the north, the Roman Republic had steadily expanded its influence. Following its victories in the Samnite Wars during the 4th century BC, Rome emerged as the dominant force in central Italy. With nearby rivals subdued, Roman leaders increasingly turned their attention toward the wealthy Greek cities of the south. Rather than relying solely on conquest, Rome often advanced through a combination of diplomacy, alliances, carefully negotiated treaties, and overwhelming reserves of manpower. This flexible approach allowed the Republic to extend its influence gradually, drawing Greek cities into its political system long before outright annexation became necessary. Rome's expansion into southern Italy did not always begin with armies marching through the countryside. In many cases, it started with a request for assistance. Several Greek cities found themselves under constant pressure from neighboring Italic tribes. Although prosperous, they often lacked the population needed to sustain prolonged military campaigns. Faced with repeated threats, some leaders concluded that an alliance with Rome offered the best chance of survival, even if that protection came with significant consequences. One notable example was Thurii. During the middle of the 3rd century BC, the city appealed to Rome for help against attacks by the Lucanians. The Roman Senate accepted the request and dispatched a military garrison to defend the settlement. At first, Roman troops appeared to be welcome allies. Yet, once they were established inside the city's walls, Rome gained considerable influence over Thurii's political decisions and foreign affairs. Security had been achieved, but at the cost of genuine independence. Similar arrangements gradually spread across parts of Magna Graecia. Some communities willingly accepted Roman protection, believing it preferable to conquest by neighboring tribes. Others, however, viewed the growing Roman presence with increasing alarm. Among the strongest opponents of Roman expansion was Taurus, known to the Romans as Tarentum. Founded centuries earlier by Spartan colonists, the city remained proud of its Greek heritage and fiercely protective of its autonomy. Relations deteriorated sharply in 282 BC, when Roman ships entered waters that the Tarentines considered their own. Interpreting the move as a violation of earlier agreements, the citizens attacked the Roman fleet, triggering a conflict that would soon draw the entire region into war. Recognizing that they could not defeat the Roman legions alone, the Tarentines sought help from one of the most accomplished commanders of the age, King Pyrrhus of Epirus. A relative of Alexander the Great's family and an experienced military leader, Pyrrhus accepted their appeal and crossed the Adriatic with an impressive army of roughly 25,000 soldiers, supported by cavalry and a force unlike anything the Romans had ever faced: war elephants. The arrival of these enormous animals caused shock among Roman troops. At the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC, Pyrrhus secured a major victory, demonstrating both his tactical brilliance and the effectiveness of his experienced Greek army. The following year, he defeated the Romans once again at the Battle of Asculum. Although successful, these victories came at an enormous cost. Thousands of his finest soldiers had fallen, losses that could not easily be replaced. Rome, by contrast, possessed an advantage that no battlefield triumph could eliminate. Its vast network of allied communities allowed the Republic to raise fresh armies again and again. Every defeat was followed by another mobilization. Pyrrhus, despite his military talent, lacked the manpower and financial resources needed for such a prolonged struggle. According to later tradition, after the costly victory at Asculum, Pyrrhus is said to have remarked that another triumph like it would ruin him completely. Whether those exact words were ever spoken remains uncertain, but the phrase Pyrrhic Victory has endured ever since, describing a success achieved at such great cost that it ultimately resembles defeat. Unable to replace his casualties or sustain the campaign indefinitely, Pyrrhus eventually withdrew from Italy. By 275 BC, his intervention had effectively come to an end, and only a few years later, in 272 BC, Taurus itself surrendered to Rome. With the fall of the most powerful Greek city on the mainland, Roman dominance over Magna Graecia became increasingly difficult to challenge. Following the defeat of Pyrrhus, Rome did not immediately erase the identity of the Greek cities it had conquered. Instead, the Republic introduced a system that allowed many communities to retain local governments and traditional institutions while placing them firmly within Rome's expanding sphere of influence. Different cities received different arrangements, but one principle remained consistent. Independent diplomacy was no longer an option. Decisions involving war, alliances, and foreign relations increasingly rested with Rome. Many Greek communities continued to manage their own civic affairs, preserving local magistrates, customs, and religious traditions. In return, however, they were expected to contribute soldiers, ships, and resources whenever the Republic called upon them. Coastal cities with strong naval traditions became especially valuable, providing experienced sailors and maritime expertise that helped strengthen Rome's growing presence at sea. Although these allies did not single-handedly create the Roman navy, they supplied knowledge and manpower that proved increasingly important as Rome expanded across the Mediterranean. At the same time, Rome pursued another effective strategy. Rather than eliminating the Greek aristocracy, it often absorbed local elites into its own political and economic system. Influential families were rewarded with prestige, commercial opportunities, and access to the wealth generated by Rome's expanding empire. Cooperation frequently offered greater rewards than resistance. By the early decades of the 3rd century BC, political independence on the Italian mainland had largely disappeared for the cities of Magna Graecia, yet the true meaning of Roman power became unmistakably clear only a few decades later during one of antiquity's greatest conflicts, the Second Punic War, when Hannibal invaded Italy after crossing the Alps in 218 BC. Many communities across the peninsula questioned whether Rome could survive. Some Greek cities saw an opportunity to recover the independence they had lost after the Pyrrhic Wars. Believing that a Carthaginian victory might restore their former freedom, several chose to abandon Rome and support Hannibal's campaign. Among the most significant were Tarentum and Syracuse. Both hoped that aligning themselves with Carthage would reverse decades of Roman expansion and allow them to reclaim their political autonomy. Instead, their decision brought devastating consequences. Rome responded with overwhelming determination. After a long and bitter siege, Syracuse fell in 212 BC. One of the wealthiest and most celebrated Greek cities of the Mediterranean was thoroughly plundered. Priceless works of art, religious treasures, and enormous quantities of wealth were carried away to Rome. Thousands of inhabitants perished during the fighting or in its aftermath, while many others were taken into slavery. The capture of Syracuse also became famous because the renowned mathematician Archimedes was killed during the city's final hours despite reported orders that he should be spared. Only a few years later, Rome turned its attention once again to Tarentum. After the city had joined Hannibal's cause, Roman forces eventually recaptured it in 209 BC. The punishment was severe. Large numbers of residents were killed or enslaved, and vast collections of artwork, valuables, and public treasures were transported north. Like Syracuse before it, Tarentum paid an enormous price for challenging Roman authority. By the conclusion of the Second Punic War in 201 BC, virtually every major Greek city in southern Italy and Sicily stood securely under Roman control. The political world that had once made Magna Graecia one of the most influential regions of the Western Mediterranean had come to an end. Independent Greek city-states no longer shaped the destiny of southern Italy. Rome now stood as the undisputed master of the region. Although Rome had conquered the Greek cities politically, it never erased the civilization they had created. In many respects, the conquerors themselves became deeply influenced by the culture of those they had defeated. Over the centuries that followed, Greek traditions, language, philosophy, and artistic achievements became woven into the very fabric of Roman society. Greek sculpture provided the model for countless Roman masterpieces, while Greek architectural principles shaped temples, public buildings, and monuments across the Republic and later the Empire. Roman authors studied Greek literature. Educated families hired Greek tutors to teach their children, and philosophy remained rooted in the works of thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, and the Pythagoreans. Even Roman religion reflected this cultural exchange, as many Greek deities were adopted, reinterpreted, and incorporated into Roman belief, often under different names while preserving many of their original characteristics. The influence of Magna Graecia was especially visible in cities where Greek traditions remained strong long after Roman rule had been established. Neapolis, modern-day Naples, became one of the best-known examples. During the early imperial period, the city continued to host festivals, athletic competitions, dramatic performances, and musical celebrations modeled on those of the Greek world. Wealthy Romans traveled there not as visitors to a foreign land, but as people seeking an authentic Greek cultural experience without leaving Italy. Language also reflected this enduring legacy. In some communities, Greek continued to be spoken for generations, existing alongside Latin in administration, commerce, and everyday life. The balance varied from region to region. While Latin gradually became dominant in government, the military, and the legal system of the Western Empire, Greek remained the preferred language of learning and intellectual life in many circles. Time, however, transformed the landscape. By the imperial era, numerous cities that had once stood among the wealthiest in Magna Graecia had lost much of their political significance. Some settlements declined as trade routes shifted, populations changed, or administrative priorities moved elsewhere. Ancient writers such as Strabo noted that southern Italy was filled with places carrying famous names from earlier centuries, even if many of those cities no longer possessed the power or prosperity that had once defined them. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire during the 5th century AD, southern Italy entered another period of profound change. Beginning in the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire re-established control over parts of the region. Together with new waves of migration from the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean, Byzantine rule helped preserve both the Greek language and the traditions of Eastern Christianity throughout several areas of southern Italy. As political authority shifted from one empire to another, elements of the ancient Greek world continued to survive. Greek remained in everyday use across certain communities well into the medieval period, even after Norman rulers had established their own kingdoms in southern Italy. The classical age had ended, but its cultural legacy endured through language, religion, local customs, and collective memory. That legacy has never disappeared entirely. Even today, small Greek-speaking communities remain in southern Italy. Known collectively as the Griko people, they are found primarily in parts of Calabria and on the Salento Peninsula in Apulia. Their precise origins remain a subject of scholarly debate. Some historians emphasize direct continuity with the ancient settlers of Magna Graecia, while others point to later Byzantine migrations. Many researchers believe the modern communities preserve elements of both traditions. The form of Greek spoken by the Griko reflects centuries of interaction between Byzantine and Italian cultures, creating a unique linguistic heritage unlike any other in Europe. Through traditional music, oral storytelling, local festivals, and family customs, these communities continue to preserve memories of a civilization that first crossed the Ionian Sea nearly 3,000 years ago. The story of Magna Graecia is therefore not simply the story of colonies that flourished and disappeared. It is the story of a culture that reshaped an entire region, influenced one of history's greatest empires, and left traces that can still be found along the shores of southern Italy today. Rome conquered the Greek cities, but Greek civilization continued to shape Rome itself, and in the voices, traditions, and identity of the Griko communities, the echoes of that ancient world have never fallen completely silent.